Hi, I'm Dr. Jeremy Neal, and I'm a professor of philosophy at Houston Baptist University. Today I want briefly to survey some different arguments that characteristically are made in the debate about drug criminalization and decriminalization. Obviously, the war on drugs that has taken place in America in the last 30 or 40 years is an enormous issue that has too many facets to be able to cover in just a short period of time. But I do want to survey a couple of arguments that typically are made on the different sides of this issue. On one side, we have persons who favor drug decriminalization. This typically means the cessation of criminal penalties for the possession or use of drugs, and sometimes also the cessation of criminal penalties for the distribution of drugs as well. A couple of different arguments that are employed by proponents of decriminalization are the utilitarian or consequentialist arguments and the deontological or rights-based arguments. First, the consequentialist arguments. Opponents of drug criminalization often argue that criminalizing drugs in fact has numerous negative effects. It creates a criminal class, persons who are devoted to a life of crime in peddling drugs to minors and to others, sneaking drugs across the border, trying to outrun police officials. It also has the negative consequence of producing a criminal youth class. When persons are imprisoned for relatively mild drug offenses, so the argument goes, they are, once they are in prison, going to encounter much more hardened criminals who in fact teach them a life of crime that is much more substantial than that to which they have so far been exposed. Other negative consequences include things like when drugs are criminalized, persons do not have access to standards in terms of health and safety when they do use drugs, and so on and so forth. An argument that is employed in favor of drug decriminalization that is deontological is the rights-based argument. Here the claim is that when drugs are criminalized, the criminalization violates the rights of persons who can do, so the argument goes, what they want to their bodies. Here the assumption seems to be that human beings have some sort of right over the bodily integrity that they experience, or some sort of right over their the ingestion of whatever substances they desire. And the argument goes, the violation of this right by means of drug criminalization is in fact a violation of something that is essential to our status as humans, namely our right over our own bodily integrity. Against those who favor drug decriminalization are other philosophers who favor drug criminalization, and they characteristically respond in kind to the utilitarian or consequentialist arguments and to the deontological or rights-based arguments. Let me start with the latter first. Proponents of drug criminalization often argue that the idea that human beings have some sort of absolute right of bodily integrity, a right to do what they will with their bodies, even if that means destroying their bodies, is a myth. And here proponents of criminalization often argue that human beings in fact are mixed with many others, connected with many others in society, and that when one of us is harmed or harms him or herself, the others are harmed as well. And so there is no such thing as some sort of non-social harm, private harm that a person does that falls within the realm of protection afforded by a right to bodily integrity. Because whenever any one of us harms himself or herself, we harm others around us, because we are part of an interconnected network of individuals who are all dependent upon each other as part of society. So, as an example, if I were to ingest a substance, a drug, that undermined my productivity at work and also my productivity as a husband, as a member of my family, then I would be damaging others as well. So goes the argument in favor of criminalization. Proponents of criminalization also argue against the consequentialist arguments that have been advanced by opponents of criminalization, and they say things like, well, the consequences of the war on drugs may be pernicious. For instance, the creation of a criminal class, or the jailing of youth for minor offenses, but the consequences would otherwise be much more pernicious if drugs were not criminalized. So it is often characteristic for proponents of criminalization to say, if there were a legal passage of some sort of bill that made drugs decriminalized, then what we would see is a much, much larger scale of drug use in the United States and in any other country that decriminalized drugs as well. And this would have pernicious consequences, negative consequences, including especially damage to the health and well-being of a large percentage of the population, if indeed it is true that a larger percentage of the population would ingest drugs and other questionable substances if drugs were decriminalized. Finally, to sum up, it's important in our inspection of debates about drug criminalization and decriminalization to notice that there are lots of different kinds of substances, and perhaps the debate should be individualized to make it intelligible for each of these different substances. So I take it that the criminalization of marijuana is a very different issue than the criminalization of cocaine. Maybe both need to be criminalized, but they have different effects as drugs, and they serve different purposes for the persons who use them, although, of course, they can both be used recreationally. Similarly, prescription drugs are very different than something like LSD or meth or some other sort of drug that is employed to obtain a high. At any rate, even though there are lots of different kinds of drugs, and the debate about drug criminalization should probably vary in accordance with these different drugs, some general principles about consequentialism and human rights do seem to be at stake in the entirety of the debate.